Kishing Karishubari Sine was a ta said the Tapari, Mubori, Tapi Muboris.
Good evening. So last week we looked at some verses pointing out that the self, challenging the view of the self as being permanent or unchanging. And this was done through presenting reasoning that if the self were unchanging, then how could it produce a result? It would be like uncompounded space. It could not produce a result if it were permanent, unchanging. And even if an unchanging self somehow could encounter conditions, how could those conditions have any impact on an unchanging self? Because if a self is unchanging, how could something, a cause, interact with it? And furthermore, we saw that if an unchanging self somehow could perform an action without changing, then how could that self have encountered the conditions required for that action? Encountering conditions necessarily requires change. So, in essence, what we looked at last time is that all functioning things, everything that can perform a function, is necessarily dependent on causes. It is not independent. The 31st verse, thus everything is under the control of other factors. Being under their power, they have no autonomy. Understanding that, seeing them as apparitions, you will not become angry at any phenomenon. The first line starts with the word thus. So this is then therefore linking to what we've been looking at, that if something were permanent, it would therefore be unchanging, which means it couldn't lead to any results because it couldn't be a cause for anything. And then the line continues. Everything is under the control of other factors. So just to say as an aside, this word translated as control, and then the next line is power, and the second line as well, autonomy. Same word translated in different ways. Back to what Genla said. So everything is under the control of other factors. In other words, everything that can produce a result can do so independent on causes. It is not independent. So every functioning thing, everything that is impermanent, every compounded phenomenon necessarily is dependent, not independent. It's dependent on other factors, such as causes and conditions. Everything here, everything that exists, but in particular, thinking of sentient beings, whether humans, whether animals, whether unseen beings. They do not cause harm independently or by means of their own free will. Rather, it comes about independence on causes and conditions, namely the afflictions. So therefore, all harm that is caused by a being is caused not out of their choice, but they are under the control of, under the power of causes, namely the afflictions. So looking at these first two lines. Can you hear me at the back? I feel I'm a bit soft. I'm okay? You can hear me at the back? Yeah? All good. Well, no, a little louder, please. Kathy, Dave, now, is it a bit better or a bit louder still? I can't see. A bit louder maybe, a little louder?
That's good.
Okay, now good. I heard someone say good. All right. So looking at the first two lines. Thus, everything is under the control of other factors. So everything here, everything that exists, but our focus is on sentient beings, whether human, animal, or unseen beings. And they are under the control of other factors. And other factors will be broad-based, but primarily we'll think of the afflictions. So because beings are under the control of their afflictions, they act in unskillful ways. And they do so not with freedom, not, as we have in the next line, autonomously or with free will. They do so under the control, under the power of the afflictions. But moreover, now we go to the second line, being under their power, they have no autonomy. We can build onto this understanding that the causes of beings' action, such as the afflictions, those causes too do not have freedom. Those causes too have come about independent on other causes and conditions. So therefore, all actions that produce a result are other-powered or under the control of other factors, and those conditions, such as afflictions, are again powered by earlier causes and conditions. So therefore, there is this entire sequence of causes and effects, or causes and conditions leading to results, and therefore, nothing in this sequence is self-powered or is independent under its own power at all. These lines go successively deeper. The first line makes a point that everything that functions does so, not with free will, but under the control of causes, such as the afflictions. The second line then shows that those causes too come about independent on causes. Therefore, this entire sequence of events that lead to results, this web of interdependence, there is nothing at any point that is independent. There is no autonomous agent at all. Now it goes deeper with the third line, starting with understanding that. Understanding that we should take to mean that not only what has been presented, that everything comes about in dependence on causes, and in the second line, those causes are cause themselves. Understanding that then refers to, therefore, because everything exists dependently, nothing at all is independent. So in the first line, everything. So everything comes about dependently, which means nothing at all is independent. However, every phenomenon appears to us as being independent. But when we investigate, we see that no phenomenon is independent or autonomous. Rather, it is empty of existing in the way that it appears. So understanding that then refers to the understanding of emptiness that comes about in dependence on recognizing that nothing exists autonomously or by way of its independently or with freedom. All phenomena, everything exists dependently and is empty of existing in the way that it appears. Understanding that, see them as apparitions. An apparition then, we understand as being, for example, a magician who creates an illusion of, say, a horse or an elephant. It will appear to us as being a real live horse or elephant, but we know it does not exist in the way that it appears. So whilst it appears, this horse, this elephant, appears as true, as real, we know it doesn't exist in the way that it appears. So that's the rest of the third line. Now into the fourth line. You will not become angry at any phenomenon. So this particularly then refers to those who cause us harm. By recognizing that they appear, the person or the being who causes us harm, we recognize that they may appear as someone causing harm, but they, like all phenomenon, do not exist in the way that they appear, as independent, as autonomous, as acting under their free will, but rather are empty of existing in the way that they appear. And therefore, they are like an apparition or an illusion. And recognizing this, the mind calms, and one will naturally be patient with this, the behavior of this illusion-like being, or this apparition. And in the same way that one would not get upset at an illusion, one recognizing that this being is just under the control of their afflictions, this way one's anger doesn't arise, and rather with patience one can respond compassionately. To develop qualities of the Dharma within, in particular those that will lead to deep and sustained change, we need to rely on reasoning, because it's through developing reasoning that we come to change our way of thinking. So too with patience. So here, the reasoning that is being presented is that we reflect that whomever we perceive as someone causing, or someone or something causing us harm, so it can be in relation to a person, an animal, an unseen being, or something inanimate. So whatever it is that we consider as being that harms us, we look at how it appears to our mind. And it will appear as being permanent or unchanging, as being permanent and unchanging, and as being self-existent, independent, as if it were acting with its own free will. This is how it appears. The person or the thing appears to us, causes and conditions, yeah? And the realization of it, is that the same as the realization of emptiness? Yeah? So the first question then, yes, that's consciousness rikpa is also dependent on causes. And when it's spoken about when one recognizes or realizes rikpa, so this really depends what is being meant by that statement. But because one can recognize many phenomena and one just comes to know them. But what is meant probably by the question is that when one comes to realize the nature of rikpa, then this will be equated to realizing that it is empty. And therefore, the wisdom that is realizing the nature of rikpa is the wisdom realizing emptiness. So it's a bit of a different topic that's spoken about in a different way. It's not my area of expertise, so I could be saying it incorrectly. But when one realizes that something is empty of existing in the way that it appears, including a very subtle thing like this consciousness of rikpa, then it would be the realization of emptiness. Because the way that we use this term rikpa in the Geluk tradition is very different from the way it's used in the Dzogchen tradition. So in the Geluk tradition, this word rikpa is translated as knower, and it's asserted as synonymous with awareness and consciousness. But this is not how the same word is used in the Dzogchen tradition, and this isn't a great area of expertise. So I don't want to be talking as if I know when it's not an area I'm well educated in. Moreover, the context of these teachings is that of sutra. In the tantric teachings, there, when one talks about this topic, then one is talking on a subtler level anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then
next week, another time. Okay.
I'll get my question here.
Okay. Yeah. But then thank you.
So page 8 in the meditation program. So
then we ask ourselves, does it exist in the way that it appears or not? And we recognize, based on these meditations that we have been doing, that if it's a person, this person does not have free will. This person is not unchanging, nor is it independent. Rather, they are acting under the influence of causes and conditions, or in the first line, under the control of other factors, such as the afflictions. Recognizing this, immediately the mind should calm, particularly if one has done these meditations for a while. And the mind staying calm means one is being patient, and thereby one can generate compassion for this being who's overwhelmed and deceived by their afflictions. So here, in dependence on one's prior meditations, one can remind oneself very quickly of what one has meditated on before, recognizing that if I look for this person, I will not find this person. I will not find a harm-doer essence within this person. This person does not exist as a person who causes harm at all. Rather, I am just imputing that onto this person, independent on causes. This is all. Therefore, the person is empty of existing in the way that they appear. So this too then serves to reinforce our calm response, our mind of patience, thereby making the arisal of compassion natural. When one meditates on, in particular if one meditates on one's own lived experiences, or recalling events that one has experienced, one can then recognize that this person who acted or spoke in an unskillful way, a harmful manner, this person had no freedom. They were under the control of their afflictions. They were under the control of other factors, namely the afflictions. So being under their power, they had no autonomy, no free will. So the one result of this reflection is that through the arisal of patience, compassion for this person will arise. Secondly, the understanding of emptiness, one's understanding of emptiness will be enhanced. And thirdly, one sees the display of the afflictions before you, how the afflictions can dominate the mind and lead to unskillful behavior, harmful behavior. This then within us should lead to a deepening revulsion for the afflictions. So here, the person before us is the afflicted person. But in addition to developing compassion for them, in addition to developing our understanding of emptiness, our revulsion for the afflictions grows, and thereby our determination to abandon them, to not be deceived by them, but to rather strengthen and develop further the antidotes. This also grows. Everything that appears to our mind. So what appears to our mind is everything we are engaging with by means of our mind. So whether it's things that we see, hear, or are thinking about, everything appears to us as being permanent or unchanging, as well as if it is independent or autonomous. This is how all phenomena appear to us. People, ourselves, material things, for example, the physical environment, all appears to us in this way. So when we're coming to the Gompa tonight, we've all walked this way many times, but yet it largely appears to us as the same as last week. In this way, it comes to our mind, appears to our mind as being permanent, unchanging, and we grasp at it, and this is this grasping at permanence. But at least intellectually, we can readily recognize that what appears to our mind does not exist in this way. Certainly everything that comes by means of our senses cannot be unchanging, but is in fact changing momentarily. Yet, this is how phenomena appear to us. Innately, they arise in our mind as being unchanging or permanent and autonomous. The 32nd verse. What will be overcome and by whom? Also, would opposing it not be illogical? If this were asked, then in dependence upon it, the continuity of all suffering is cut. There is nothing illogical in asserting that. So in the 31st verse, we hear that no phenomenon exists by way of its own nature or essence, but is empty of existing in this way. So hearing this, then someone has a doubt. They ask the question that if something does not exist by way of its own essence or nature, it cannot exist. It would be non-existent. So therefore, what you're saying makes no sense. And they express this doubt with, what will be overcome and by whom? So what will be overcome? If, for example, an affliction doesn't exist by way of its own nature or essence or characteristic, what are you talking about? It cannot exist then. So you're saying what you want to abandon doesn't exist. And then if a person doesn't exist by way of their own nature or essence or characteristic, then that person cannot exist either. So who would be this person overcoming what? And moreover, what kind of path would they be cultivating? How would that path exist? So these virtuous qualities, these surely wouldn't exist either, because unless they exist by way of their own essence or nature, they cannot exist. And what kind of liberation would it lead to? What is this liberation? Because that too then, because you said in the previous verse, everything, so it was all inclusive. So even liberation would not, if it doesn't exist by way of its own nature or essence, that too would be non-existent. So what are you talking about? So this really is the doubt that is arising because it has been presented that things do not exist by way of their own nature or essence, are empty of existing in this way. So the person who's asking this doubt or expressing this doubt believes, therefore you're talking about non-existence. So what you are saying makes no sense. It's illogical. And this is a debate that one comes across in texts that are written according to the Prasangika view, because it's Prasangikas alone who say that phenomena do not exist by way of their own nature or essence. They do not exist from their own side. All other Buddhists hold that phenomena do exist from their own side. So whether they hold the tenets of the Vaibhashika, the Sautrantika, the Chittamatra, or the Madhyamaka Svatrantika, they all say phenomena do exist by way of their own nature or essence, as do non-Buddhists. So therefore, in texts written such as this, text written according to that of the Prasangika, this view, that this debate comes up many times, because it's Prasangikas alone that says everything, so all phenomena, whether it's something material, such as a house or environment, or something, or people, or things such as afflictions, virtuous minds, and states such as samsara and nirvana, all exist solely, or all exist only in dependence on imputation by mind, or labeling by mind, or designation by mind. All are empty of existing from their own side, or by way of their own nature or essence. So then, as we see here, the non-Prasangikas will say, you Prasangikas have gone too far. You are extremists. You have eliminated meditators. You've eliminated persons. You've eliminated virtuous qualities, the paths. You've eliminated cause and effect, liberation, Buddhahood, because your presentation says this doesn't exist from its own side, therefore it cannot be existent at all. So this debate then comes up very regularly. This particular part that we are in the 6th chapter is to do with philosophical views, and these are more challenging to understand. We've been looking at this now for a few weeks, and previously we looked at how non-Buddhists present the self. So when they investigate the self, they will reject that the self is the body. They'll say it's something other than the body, but it does exist, and how? It's permanent, so it's unchanging, and it is eternal in that it has no beginning and has no end. It is autonomous, or has free will, it has agency, but it is not dependent on causes, and it's not dependent on parts. So this is what we saw earlier, how they assert that the self, we probably say soul, but the self is something unchanging, being permanent, eternal, no beginning or end, and is autonomous, has free will, but not dependent on causes, not dependent on parts. That was then how non-Buddhists present the self. Then amongst the differing views of Buddhists, so some Vaibhashika, they say that, well, being Buddhists, they certainly accept that the self exists and is a functioning thing. So it is impermanent, it's not permanent. So there is a clear difference with the non-Buddhists who hold that the self is unchanging. Buddhists, Vaibhashika, say, no, it does change. It changes momentarily. It's a functioning thing. But they need to then assert what that self is. So when they investigate, they need to then find something. And they say, well, we believe that the self is the physical aggregate, because wherever we are, wherever we have come from, where we go, we do so in relation to our body. I was there, I am here, I'm going there. Or if we are experiencing something, maybe I'm feeling sick, then it's in relation to the body. So some of the Vaibhashikas will assert the form aggregate as the body. So the Buddhist philosophical schools are presented as four, but within these four, there are subdivisions. So the Vaibhashika, they have many subdivisions. So there's the one that say that the self is the form aggregate. There are others who say that it is the collection of the five aggregates. So the collection of form, feeling, differentiation, compositional factors, and consciousness. And then there is another one. I'm going to say the name, but I don't know it. So there is another one who says the person is something different. It's not what any of you say. We can really only explain it by means of an analogy, in that in the same way as a person who's carrying a heavy load, this load bearer, being a load bearer, wherever they go, they necessarily are carrying their load. So this is like the relationship between the person and the aggregates. Like the person is carrying the load of the burden of the aggregates. And then when they are asked, in the sub-school of the Vaibhashika are asked, so this person that is carrying the load or the burden of the aggregates, are they permanent or impermanent? Their reply is, well, we cannot really say. It's something other than that. So that in brief was the Vaibhashika, the Great Exposition School. Then the second, the Sautrantika, or the Sutra School. So when they investigate, when they seek the self, they say it is not the body. This for sure, because our body doesn't travel with us from life to life. And it's not actually any of the aggregates, but they would point out to be the mental consciousness. They say this mental consciousness that goes from life to life, this is the illustration of the self. So they certainly hold that the self exists. There's the self that's listening, a self that's sleeping, that's eating. So there is a self. But when one investigates, it comes down to the subtle consciousness, or the consciousness that goes from life to life. In the Chittamatra or mind-only school, they say, whilst the illustration of the self is consciousness, it's not the regular consciousnesses that you other Buddhists talk about, the sense consciousnesses or the mental consciousness. These aren't stable enough. There's rather an additional consciousness that is the self, the mind basis of all, or the foundation consciousness. This is the self. Then we come to the fourth school, the Madhyamaka school, the middle way school. So again, all these various Buddhist philosophical schools have subdivisions. So one of the subdivisions, the Svatrantika, they say it's mental consciousness, but subtle mental consciousness. So this is what they say is found when you analyze, when you seek out the self. So all the Buddhist schools go through the same process of independence, of reasoning and analysis. They come to an illustration of the self. So the Svatrantika, by means of meditation and analysis, come to show that the subtle mental consciousness is the illustration of the self. All these illustrations of the self, but from the various Buddhist schools, they come to this point through analysis, through investigation. And they say, this is what the self is. So the different philosophical schools will point to something different, but they all say, when I look for the self, this is what I find. So they will say that the self is self-existent. It exists from its own side. And what is it? It is this, in the case of the Svatrantika, the subtle mental consciousness. In the case of the Chittamatra, it's a foundation consciousness, or the mind basis of all. So they'll all come to something, they'll say, when you look, this is what the self is, and it is self-existent. It exists from its own side. And this is the case for everything that exists. It exists from its own side. When you look, you will find something. So when they look by means of analysis, investigation, and the meditation, they'll say it does exist from its own side. If it did not, it would be non-existent. And that then links to what we've been discussing here. Then the final Buddhist school, the Madhyamaka Prasangika, the consequentialists. So when they investigate, they say, we hear what you other Buddhists say, and yes, I can understand that you say something is found and therefore it's self-existent, but when you're not looking deeply enough, if you look deeper, you will come to recognize there is no abiding essence or nature that establishes anything. Nothing exists from its own side. Nothing is self-existent at all. When you look more deeply, when you are not blinded or confused by ignorance, all you'll come to recognize or to realize is the mere empty state. All that is found is emptiness. Empty of existing by way of its own nature, empty of existing by way of its own essence, defining characteristics or self-essence. So this is what the Prasangikas assert. But then they explain a little further. They're saying, but we are not saying that nothing exists at all. Rather, the person does exist. The person, for example, does exist. But it doesn't exist by way of its own nature or essence. Rather, it is merely labeled by mind. It is dependent on labeling, on designation, on imputation. So, for example, the person is imputed by mind onto the aggregates or onto the subtle mental consciousness. The Prasangika, the Madhyamaka Prasangika, in English, the autonomous middle way school, they say we present the correct middle way view, or our view is that of the middle way. In that, we say the person does not exist from its own side, but we do not say the person is non-existent. So the person does exist, but merely labeled by mind. So we're saying the person is not self-existent, and the person is also not non-existent. Rather, between these two extremes of self-existence and non-existence, the person is merely labeled by mind. Doesn't exist by way of its own nature, essence, or characteristics. It only exists as being labeled by mind. So this is the meaning of the middle way. It's the view in the middle of these two extremes. One extreme of self-existence and the other extreme of non-existence. Many texts have middle way in their title, and this is the middle way that is being referred to. So some, such as Chandrakirti's entry into the middle way, or Nagarjuna's root verses of the middle way, what is usually translated as, anyway, something like that. And there's Aryadeva's 400 verses of the middle way. So many texts have this middle way in the title, and according to the Prasangika, the meaning of the middle way is between these two extremes of self-existence, which other Buddhists assert, and the other extreme of non-existence. So all of that was to explain this discussion, this debate here. And this is something that comes up many times, because the non-Prasangikas, they are non-Prasangikas because they do not accept the Prasangika view. They say to the Prasangikas that what will be overcome and by whom? Also, what would opposing it not be illogical? Because they hear what the Prasangikas are saying, but the way they understand things being not established from their own side means they do not exist. So they see the Prasangika as these extremists, not as middle way proponents, but as extremists who say that there is no such thing as a person. There are no objects of abandonment, the afflictions. These don't exist. There are no virtuous paths to be cultivated, because you are saying none of these exist, or none of these are self-existent. Therefore, you must be saying they don't exist at all, which means you're also saying there's no liberation, there's no Buddha, and so forth. So this is what this confusion comes about. And it comes about because they do not accept the Prasangika view, and therefore they are not Prasangikas, hence this discussion. Then Prasangika reply in the third and fourth line, independence upon it, the continuity of all suffering is cut. There is nothing illogical in asserting that. So Prasangika first will respond by saying, you non-Prasangikas, because all other Buddhists will be holding the view above, they'll have a different understanding of what the self is, but they will all say that the self is self-existent, or that phenomena exist from their own side. So the Prasangika say to them, you are mistaken. You have not thought clearly about this. If the self or any phenomenon existed from its own side, you haven't thought about the consequences of that. If something existed from its own side, it couldn't change. So if, say, the self had its own abiding essence, that could not ever change. So how could a path be developed? How could afflictions be abandoned? Because if paths existed by way of their own essence, how could they be cultivated? How could they be developed further? Likewise with afflictions. If they existed by way of their own essence or were self-existent, how could they be either grow in strength or slowly diminish and be eventually eradicated? They could not. Nothing could be that were self-existent. So this is the first answer to the non-Prasangika, is pointing out the consequence of their extreme view, their misunderstanding, their grasping at things as being self-existent. Thereafter, they say independence upon it, so really independence on the union or the harmony of dependent arising and emptiness. One will come to cut the continuity of all suffering. This then refers to, through developing an understanding of the harmony of dependence arising and emptiness, the afflictions are abandoned. One will first gain the point where one will never be born in the lower realms. And one will develop one's virtuous qualities, one's understanding of the union of dependent arising and emptiness further, to the point where one gains liberation from samsara in its entirety. So in this way, we see that in independence upon it, so independence here on cultivating the view of the Prasangika, the continuity of all suffering is cut. There is nothing illogical in asserting that. And again, this comes down to what is being asserted, is that phenomena all exist dependently. They are empty of existing inherently or by way of their own self-existence. And this is the harmony of dependent arising and emptiness. And there is nothing illogical in that assertion. So all of this philosophy, hopefully it's a little interesting, but really we need to come to see how this is useful for us. So we need to come to see, how do we relate to the self? Do you relate to it in the way that the non-Buddhists relate to the self, or in the way of these non-Prasangikas? What is the way that we think, or how do we relate to the self as existing? So we talk in relation to the self a lot. We talk about, or think about, how we're feeling. I'm feeling happy, I'm feeling relaxed, or I'm so busy, I have all these activities. So we talk about ourselves, or we think about ourselves a lot. But we don't really think about, so how does the self exist? We just think about all that we are busy with, or that we are happy, or that we are not. We don't tend to think more deeply. And I suppose if most people were asked, then, so tell me, what is the self? They would probably relate to their body, say something in relation to their physical body, because we do relate so to our body as being ourselves. Here, though, now yourselves, as Buddhists, you would have been introduced to this philosophy, But for most people and for ourselves, before we ever thought about this, probably we related to ourselves mainly by means of our body. Likewise, if we eat food, we tend to always have an opinion on the food in that, I don't really like this, or yeah, this is quite good, or yeah, it will do. We have some kind of view on whether the food is delicious or not, or where on that spectrum it sits. But why do we think that? So we probably, when we're passing our judgment on the meal, we don't really think, so why am I saying this? So where is this, what is it that we are finding delicious or not? So we may point to something in the food, but if we looked a little deeper, we'd say, well, it's a taste I'm really talking about. And that taste, well, then we'd probably point to our tongue. But then if you think a bit deeper, we'll say, well, it's not really our tongue. It's by means of our tongue that a thought arises, or a feeling arises, a feeling of it being tasty or not. So in this way, we have this thought, or we'd say maybe feeling, of it being tasty or not. So if we take the taste of a lemon, so everyone will agree a lemon has a sour taste. Most people will find that taste maybe a little nice or a little not nice. So there are these two different views. Some enjoy the taste or the sour taste of a lemon, some really do not. So the Prasangika understanding applied here, which this would be an illustration of, you see, it cannot exist by way of its own essence. The taste of the lemon cannot exist from its own side. It cannot be self-existent, because then surely, if it did, then everyone would experience it in the same way. But this is not the case. Rather, whether the sour taste of the lemon is delicious or not is dependent upon being labeled or imputed or designated by mind. The taste itself cannot be self-existent. Otherwise, it would have to be experienced in the precise same way, but it is not. Rather, it is labeled delicious or not in dependence on its experience as delicious or not, in dependence on labeling. You would have come across this as well in the conversations between His Holiness and scientists, where they've looked at taste, and they've looked at the atoms, the particles that make up the taste of something. And they say, when we look, we cannot find any final particle. We cannot find any smallest particle. We cannot find something there that determines the taste. Our time is already up tonight. So we've spoken a bit about the various views in Buddhism, and also briefly touched again on non-Buddhist views. So take the understanding you've been hearing over these weeks. Particularly tonight, we spoke a little more about the Prasangika view, and then apply it to your own experience. See how phenomena, such as the self, appear to your mind. And then, in the way that you've been guided, investigate to see whether it exists in the way that it does or not. So depending on the teachings you've heard prior to this, apply that and come to see whether the self and other phenomena exist in the way they are not. Whether they exist in the way they appear or not. Okay, then thank you. We can conclude there for this week. Thank you very much.